Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. When we talk about great cover songs, there seems to be a handful of examples we always come back to. Johnny Cash's Hurt, Aretha Franklin's Respect, Limp Bizkit's Behind Blue Eyes, but there's one song that sits above the rest, one cover that so perfectly reimagines the original that it almost becomes the original, to the point where the original artist started playing the cover version too. I'm talking, of course, about Jimi Hendrix's version of All Along the Watchtower, written by Bob Dylan. Let's take it apart. Right off the bat, Hendrix lets you know he's not messing around. Dylan's song starts like this. Hendrix, on the other hand, starts like this. Or technically that's Dave Mason playing a 12-string acoustic, a nice little nod to the song's folk roots, but that's about where the similarities end. Even the way they use their chords is different, so let's start with those. When I talk about chord loops, I often talk about the idea of harmony not as a journey, but as a location, and this is a perfect example. It takes 4 seconds to play, and all the harmonic motion is identical. We're just sliding up and down in whole steps. Listening to the song, I get the sense that sometimes the chord is higher and sometimes it's lower, but it never really feels like it's changing. It's more rotating. It's a tide ebbing and flowing between C minor and A flat major, with his B flat serving as kind of a hinge connecting them. This sort of static, motionless loop is a perfect fit for the song. The lyrics are full of references to feeling trapped or stuck. There must be some kind of way out of here, I can't get no relief, and later on, All Along the Watchtower, Princess kept her view. Pairing those words with a chord loop that's endlessly wandering back and forth puts you right up on that watchtower with her. Dylan's intro embraces this effect, starting on the high chord, in his case C sharp minor, and just letting the loop roll. Hendrix, though, starts on the middle chord, B flat, the connective tissue of the loop, creating motion where it shouldn't really exist. While Dylan's part wanders aimlessly, Hendrix is pacing like a caged tiger. When Dylan says there must be some kind of way out of here, it's speculation, but for Hendrix, it's insistent, impatient. Dylan wants a way out. Hendrix needs one. This is also emphasized by the rhythmic figure. He's playing groups of 6 attacks, with 3 before the bar line and 3 after. We get 2 hits on that B flat chord, and then right before the downbeat, he shifts up or down. This change is accompanied by the drums, where the B flats are supported by bright, attention-grabbing snares, while the other chords get relatively subtle kicks instead. The strong rhythmic pattern makes you really feel the weight that B flat is carrying, holding the entire loop together while being pulled apart by the chords on either side. You feel it getting cut off an 8th note early, shoved out of the way so our main chords can shine. The B flat will fade into the background a bit as the song goes on, but this intro makes sure you never forget it's there. Supporting that rhythmic figure, we have the most iconic thwack in rock music, played by Brian Jones on an instrument called a vibraslap. It's on beat 3 in the dead space between chords, creating the sort of halftime backbeat feel we might typically expect from a snare drum, but the vibraslap is a much more interesting choice. That thin wooden echoing sound fits the song perfectly, simultaneously creating a sense of space and of enclosure. You might think this is the only time in the song we hear it, but that's not quite true. I'll let you know when it comes back. From there, Hendrix finally joins in, and we get our first glimpse of possibly the most important change in the whole song. He's playing an electric guitar. Mind-blowing stuff, I know, but in order to really understand this cover, we need to understand a bit about the time period. Hendrix's version was released as a single in 1968, and the late 60s were an extremely important time in the history of the guitar. Earlier that decade, transistor technology had finally gotten small enough to allow for the invention of stomp boxes, introducing the world to its first modern effect pedals. Now iconic sounds like the wah pedal and the octave pedal were brand new, and Hendrix was one of the first people to truly recognize the potential of the new technology. His work revolutionized the way we think about the electric guitar, so taking this folky acoustic intro and replacing it with his signature electric sound wasn't just a choice, it was a statement. He was looking Dylan directly in his eyes and saying, "This is mine now. It belongs to me." Before we talk about what he's actually playing, though, I want to take a look at Mitch Mitchell's drums. There's a snare on every beat, giving it this incessant marching pattern. Now, this is borrowed from Dylan's version, where drummer Kenny Buttrey did roughly the same thing, but Mitchell takes it to another level. Buttrey's playing is fairly laid back, and once we get to the verse, Mitchell will be too, but here he's aggressive and in your face, riding that beat to really emphasize the metric tension of a 4-beat snare pattern. But okay, let's get back to the guitar. This solo is built on the exact same rhythmic pattern as the intro, with 6 attacks spread evenly across the bar line. And why not? It's a great pattern, and it gives the solo its own identity by tying it directly to the intro through the shared rhythmic motif. In each of the first 3 phrases, he uses that rhythm to emphasize a single note, first D, then F, then G. In the last bar, he changes things up, delaying the resolution, but ultimately going back to C. Let's compare this to Dylan's harmonica solo. Here, he's mostly just going back and forth between C sharp and G sharp, the root and fifth. They're the 2 simplest points in the key, and they work great for a folk-inspired piece like Dylan's, but Hendrix's addition of the 4th and especially the 2nd adds a lot more spice. It gives the solo a real contour, slowly circling toward the root instead of just starting there. After that, we get to the verse. The melody here is pretty straightforward, mostly centered on the root with occasional trips to neighboring chord tones.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
Neither Dylan nor Hendrix is known for their vocal acrobatics. They're both pretty naturalistic singers, so a simple, tight melody like this is a perfect fit for both their voices. It lets them dig into the meanings of the words without having to wrestle with a complicated melody that would really only get in the way. In the second half, though, it does open up a bit, with Hendrix starting some of the lines on G-flat, the tritone,
Businessman there, drink my wine.
to add more of a bluesy bite. Again, this is something Dylan did too.
Businessman, they drink my wine.
But his delivery has that classic Dylan detachment. When he sings about the businessmen, it's to create a mystery, but in Hendrix's voice you can almost hear disdain. He's spitting the words out, and he's leaning on that tritone to make you feel it too. Underneath that, Dave Mason's rhythm guitar is still playing the loop. For the most part, he's doing long-held chords. But for the final one, he switches to some loud accented strums, once again highlighting that B-flat, the connective tissue Dylan tried to hide. It's like a little turnaround, making each repetition feel like an event. But if you listen to the song, Mason's part probably isn't the first thing you'll notice here. Over the first 3 chords, Hendrix sings the lyrics, but here, over the B-flat, is where he puts his guitar fills. Now, there's 3 verses, each with 8 phrases, which means 24 total fills. Some of them are busy, some are short and sweet, and some are barely there at all. I'm not going to talk about each one individually because I'd rather this video not be an hour long, and besides, I think that's missing the point. These are ad-libs, decorations invented in the moment, so understanding them is less about breaking them down note by note and more about examining the underlying language he used to craft them. Looking through all the licks, the first thing I notice is that they're mostly using C minor pentatonic. There's an occasional A-flat, and one G-flat that I'm not convinced he played on purpose. But for the most part, it's these 5 notes. Or actually, it's mostly these 4 notes. He tends to hold back the C until the very end of each lick, dropping it on the downbeat to wrap up the line. Until then, he mostly leans on the scale's main color tones, E-flat and especially B-flat, which gives the fills more flavor, but leaves them feeling less grounded. In music theory, the word unresolved comes with a lot of implications that I'm not sure really apply here, but in a colloquial sense at least, it's a good description of the way these licks feel. They're questions without clear answers. And there's one last detail I want to cover in the verse, this little E-flat. He doesn't always play it, but it's there more than half the time. I think it's a crucial part of the song's sound, and it's my video, so I'm going to talk about it. It's usually played as a pull-off from F, so we get this satisfying sense of landing on the note, sliding into a nice, comfortable third. It's on beat 2, implying a backbeat feel, but not a complete one. I mean, it could have been if he'd played something similar on beat 4. But personally, I think that sounds boring. It's too balanced. Doing just beat 2 pulls your rhythmic attention away from the downbeat, but then doesn't give it anywhere else to go. It feels uneven, and for lack of a better word, deranged. It doesn't happen often enough to establish a pattern, so you're never fully ready for it, and it creates this almost through the looking glass feeling, distorting your interpretation of the surrounding narrative. When you picture the conversation between the Joker and the thief, your image of them is fundamentally warped by this off-kilter E-flat. Or maybe not. Maybe I'm making a big deal about nothing. I do have a tendency to do that, but I really don't think that's what's happening here. When I listen to Dylan's version, I miss the guitar solos, sure, but more than anything, I miss this accent. This little E-flat figure emphasizing the occasional weak beat keeps me unsettled in a way that makes Hendrix's version resonate deep in my bones. Here, listen to what it sounds like without it.
There must be some kind of way.
To my ears, that's not all along the Watchtower. It just doesn't feel the same. Anyway, this leads us into the second solo, which I think is a really good demonstration of how to play a solo that actually, works. The secret is pacing. A lot of guitar solos drop as many notes as possible as quickly as they can, but if you listen to Hendrix here, You'll see that each bar has some fast bits, but he's also taking time to hang on a note to give you a chance to absorb its emotional impact. The basic pattern here is a long note on beat 1, then some noodling in the back half of the bar to set you up for the next one, but as he goes, this starts to break down. In bar 3, he delays the arrival of the long note. In bar 6, he doubles up with 2 miniature accents. And in bar 7, he speeds up even more, abandoning the long-held note entirely in favor of a big run down the scale. But throughout the solo, you can tell he's thinking not just about notes, but about space, because that space is what gives the notes meaning. So let's talk about that meaning. What is this solo trying to tell us? Well, the best way to do that is to look at which notes he emphasizes. Going through the first 5 bars, we get a melody like this, starting on a high C, and with the exception of this G, walking steadily up the scale a step at a time. You can read this as the Joker's rising anxiety or as slow progress towards a possible escape. That's the beautiful thing about musical imagery, it can tell multiple stories at the same time. Heck, you might even read this as something completely different that I haven't even thought of. It's your story, I'm not going to tell you how it goes. Point is, something is rising, but not very fast. In the second half though, the course reverses. After the E flat, he quickly falls down to C and then G over the course of a bar. We've lost all the ground we've gained and then some, after which we get that big fast walk down the scale and settle on a low E flat an octave below where we started, which is interesting, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I listen to guitar solos, they mostly seem to follow a pretty similar pattern. You start low and build high, creating a climax at the end of the section. Here though, he starts on basically the highest note, and after pushing up just a little bit more, we get this huge downward trajectory. Narratively, this could be the thief calming the Joker down like we see in the next verse, or it could be a realization that there is no way out of there. Structurally though, I think it's mostly because this isn't really a solo. Or, I mean, it's a solo, but it's not the solo. It's more filling the role of an interlude, and this contour helps it avoid creating too much fanfare before the second verse. Here, the main new thing is that the melody shifts up, centering some of its lines on G to raise the energy level.
No reason to get excited.
But let's be honest, you didn't click this video to hear me talk about the second verse. You've been waiting very patiently, so now it's time to move on to the main event. This may be my favorite guitar solo ever recorded, definitely top 5, and the reason it's so great is because of its structure. Now, every good guitar solo has structure, but this one has chapters. He plays 4 separate 8-bar solos, each with its own effects, its own approach, and its own musical vocabulary. If he just played any one of them, it would have sounded great, but stringing them all together like this shows a mastery of his instrument that few guitarists have ever been able to replicate. I want to look at each of them individually, starting with chapter 1, the normal solo. As the name implies, this is a pretty typical blues rock solo. A very good one to be sure, but it's using the same basic tools as his last solo, playing fast bits to create motion, and then hanging on notes to give that motion meaning. The pace is faster here, and the held notes don't last as long, so the trajectory isn't quite as simple to define, but it does seem to be mostly trending upward like we'd expect. It drops down at the very end, because we've got a lot more soloing to do and we're not ready for the climax yet, but beyond that, I don't have a lot to say here that I didn't already say about the last one, which means it's time for chapter 2, the slide solo. Here, he cranks up his delay pedal and starts playing around with a slide. The fast notes are gone, everything is at least a quarter note long, and if we just look at the beginnings and ends of the slides, he's sticking to pretty simple notes, mostly in the middle register. As he slides around the guitar, the track pans to different places in the mix, as if Hendrix is floating around the room as he plays. Whereas chapter 1 was about the contrast between speed and space, chapter 2 is all space. It creates this lonely, empty sound where the notes slowly melt into each other and then melt away. It conjures an image of the cold distance outside the watchtower, the endless expanse that surrounds us and keeps us trapped. We're staring into the abyss, and the abyss is staring right back until we finally look away in chapter 3, the wah solo. Here he switches to a wah pedal, which, if you're not familiar, basically swoops a frequency filter up and down to change the tone of the instrument. To accent that, he starts playing really fast. The section is full of 16th note runs. He does stop for air occasionally, but all these rapid-fire notes let you really hear the different tones the wah pedal is creating. The contour doesn't have much of an overall direction. The lines tend to point downward, but they all start around the same place. That, combined with the exciting rhythms and the raucous sound of the wah pedal, conjures an image of revelry within the watchtower, something that's never explicitly described in the lyrics, but feels all too evident to me in Hendrix's interpretation of the solo. It has an almost Mask of the Red Death vibe to it, with jubilant revelers partying inside the watchtower while outside the world slowly dies. Considering the historical context, it's hard not to view this as a statement about the Vietnam War, but Polyphonic already made that argument, so I'll just link to his video in the description. The song mostly reflects the chaos of the war, but for these 8 bars, Hendrix takes time to call out the elites who are both most responsible and most insulated from the consequences. It's a reminder that the horrors of war aren't distributed evenly, a coin we see the other side of in Chapter 4, the rhythmic solo. This is built on a single repeating idea, alternating beats of 8th and 16th note clusters in a consistent 2-bar pattern. In fact, the first bar of it is pretty much identical each time, with the second playing some variation on the same theme. This rigid structure, with its emphasis on each individual beat, makes this chapter feel like a march to me, like we've left the watchtower entirely and are now on the front lines of the war. The first bar feels ordered and organized, like the idealized vision of an army, while the second bar with its constant 16th notes is the chaos and panic of an actual war front. After the third time, the ordered part collapses entirely, leaving us with this screaming build-up to end the solo. But there's one last thing I want to point out here. Listen closely to beat 3. It's the Vibraslap. The Vibraslap is back. Why? I'm not entirely sure, but if we follow the war story, it does kinda sound like an exploding shell, doesn't it? Like, not literally, but it has that sort of musical symbolism to it. For the first half, it hits on beat 3 like it did in the intro, but in the second, as we descend further into chaos, it gets pulled forward to beat 2, echoing that unbalanced E-flat thing from the verses. See, I told you that rhythm was important. From there, he drops us into the third verse, where the range has shifted up again, including this high B-flat at the start. And then we wind up in the outro featuring yet another solo that uses my absolute favorite solo technique, just like playing one note over and over. It starts on C, then it slowly walks up the rest of the scale, ending up on a high C where it sits for 10 bars until the song fades out. And that's pretty much it, but before we go, let's answer the question from the beginning. How did Jimi Hendrix create the best cover song ever recorded? By finding something not even Bob Dylan knew was there. He loved Dylan's song, but he didn't just want to play it, he wanted to show the world what Dylan missed, and he dug deep to uncover the true potential within the piece. Oh, and it helps that he was one of the greatest guitarists and, for my money, one of the best singers who ever lived. He put his voice into the song both literally and figuratively, and in doing so, he made it completely his own, to the point where it's hard to imagine anyone else doing it differently. That's what makes a great cover. And hey, thanks for watching. As always, this song was chosen by my patrons on Patreon. The poll to pick the next one goes up over there next week. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.